Stuart Cameron Talks Rugby, and today we're talking rugby with Stuart McFARLANE, a correspondent from Radio Borders. And of course, Stuart, it's a very interesting season ahead. August the 27th is when all kicks off, but so vital for the teams in Premier 1 and Premier 2, because 20 of them only will be taking part next season in the 10-team Premiership and the 10-team National League when everything goes regionalised. So 4 teams will drop down effectively to regional rugby, and of course there are many from the borders who fit that category and will want to be keeping their heads above the water.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very critical season, as you say, Stuart. Probably the most significant season in some time, because how the clubs perform this year will, as you say, shape things up for the seasons ahead, because of this new league structure, which we'll obviously talk about when it comes into being the season after the one about to kick off. It's going to completely reshape the look of Scottish club rugby, and perhaps a lot of people look at it and say it's perhaps the most significant development since the early mid-70s, when the very origins of the leagues that we know today were devised and were introduced to the game. So, as you mentioned, there's an awful lot at stake for clubs, and particularly I think clubs, as you mentioned, that fit the category of those that haven't had the best performing seasons in Premier 2 in recent times. Those clubs that don't necessarily start terribly well, there'll be even more pressure on them. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the clubs gel and how many points they can rack up early on, because that word pressure, it's bandied around an awful lot in sport, and how much emphasis we put on that, I suppose, depends on how much pressure we believe clubs are under. I think a lot of clubs, a lot of players, a lot of coaching staff right from the outset will know this is a hugely significant year.
Now, of course, as last year, you've got Premier 1, Premier 2 and Premier 3. Now, we'll do away with Premier 3 at the moment because they're going to go straight to regional rugby next season. So it really is all down to Premier 1 and Premier 2. And as last year, the top 8 in Premier 1 will fight out Premier A, which is a straight fight for the championship, and those 8 will be safe effectively to be part of the new Premiership for next season. Now, the bottom 4 will join the top 4 from Premier 2 as last year in Premier B, and this is where it gets interesting, because the top 2 will go to the new Premiership. The bottom 6 are safe. They will be in the National League for the next season. But now Premier C becomes very interesting. That will be made up of the bottom 8 sides in Premier 2, and it really is going to be so vital for them, because the top 4 from those bottom 8 in Premier C will get into national rugby, but the bottom 4 are going to drop down to regionals, and they'll be playing teams like Haddington, Hoyt YM, Langham, Berwick, Duns, Musselburgh. It really is so vital to get that start. And of course, when we look at teams like Kelso, our very own Kelso, of course, who have had bad starts over the past few seasons, but this year there's going to be no opportunities for them to make a comeback from a bad start of the season.
You don't want to be in the low reaches of any division. And certainly as the season wears on, the teams that will be in the low reaches of any of the divisions, as we mentioned the word pressure there, the microscope will be very much on those teams to see how they perform. As you say, the top 8 in Premier A, a straight fight. There will be the odd 1 or 2 fixtures that will be regarded by some people certainly as meaningless fixtures. It depends how competitive the division is, because you don't necessarily see going into the final stages of the season all 8 sides in with a realistic chance of winning the championship. But you fancy that if you're in a position early on in the season, if you can build up some momentum and get away from the bottom places of whichever division you're in, you stand a chance. And I always think that there can be a spell in the middle part of the season when it sometimes gets a little bit truncated, that teams lose a bit of momentum, when the pitches begin to cut up a little bit, when they have a bit of an injury count as well. These are important factors. These are all so crucial this season coming up. How teams deal with the disappointment of a defeat in a game that they think they should have won, how they deal with a run of defeats when they're unable to get points, when they're there or thereabouts in matches but they're performing very well and not taking anything away from games. That can sometimes be the most dispiriting thing for a coach, and I think this year more than at any time it's going to be so crucial for coaches to try and ensure that the players can pick themselves up from defeat, can believe that they can improve their performances and climb the table. Because as you say, I mean, it's almost like you end up in quicksand if you're in the bottom places of each of those divisions, because you do go down, and this new structure, you're going down pretty quickly.
Gala, Hawick and Melrose are targeting Premier 1, of course, this year. Gala winning promotion. Selkirk were relegated, so they're in the mix in Premier 2, along with Peebles and Kelso and Jed Forest. And of course, what a scrap that's going to be, because we've got 4 Premier 2 sides effectively. And I mean, we would obviously love putting on our Borders hat to see all 7 of our Premiership sides go into the Premiership for next year, which would make over a third of the teams from the Borders, which would be a fantastic achievement for the area. But equally, all 4 could go down.
It's a knife edge. There's a fine line between success and failure, and you look at that in any sport, and I think this has been emphasised this year in rugby, as you say, that there's a fine line. If teams in the Borders in Premier 2, the ones you mentioned, if they start well and are competing for those top 4 places in Premier 2, I mean, that's a wonderful scenario for us as impartial followers of each of the Border clubs. But we are parochial, we are looking for the Border teams to succeed. What we don't necessarily want to do, but we again have to be impartial and fair, is report on sides, whether they're Border clubs or clubs from out with the area, who are struggling. But as you say, the magic scenario for us would be to have a situation where all the Border sides are performing well, where the sides you mentioned in Premier 2 are all with a chance of going into, finishing in one of those top 2 places for the new Premiership. Again, it comes to strength and depth. Again, it comes to character. Again, I suppose it comes to the sides that have stayed together, that have endured success and disappointment. Those sides that have endured disappointment, those sides that have had a bad season or two, it's about the strength of their character and the belief that they can turn things round. At the start of a new season, they have a slightly different mindset, that they can win games that they perhaps don't necessarily play so well in, that they can pick up points in previous seasons they would miss out on. It's going to be so important that they do that this season, and I think it's always important to start well.
Now, obviously, the teams, there's been a few changes, close season, people have gone away and people have come back, etc. Let's just look at Premier 1 briefly, first of all. Gala, Hawick and Melrose.
Well, you look at Melrose and you look at the success that Craig Chalmers and the Melrose coaching staff have had since, I think, his first piece of silverware was the Border League Championship down at Riverside Park in April of 2006. And I remember him saying at the time that this, he hoped, was the start of a successful spell at the club, because he said the players are winners now. They've something to show for that. There has been a little bit of traffic in and out. They have a big squad to choose from. They are in many people's eyes, they are in a very enviable position, because they have that flexibility. If the half-back partnership first choice are injured, they've a strong half-back partnership to come in and do a good job. And the same goes for the front row, the second row, the back row. They have good heads. They've old heads, but they've got a lot of young legs as well there. So while you look at their success and you look back over the last 5 years and say, OK, they missed out on 1 or 2 cup final victories, but aside from that, they've done remarkably well in all competitions. You still look forward and say they've got a good squad. They're certainly going to be disappointed if they're not there and thereabout contesting all the competitions. And I think the British and Irish Cup and their involvement in that competition last season in particular won't have done the players any harm at all.
Now, Melrose, out goes Callum Anderson, who's working up in Aberdeen, so he'll be turning out for Aberdeen Grammar. Scott White obviously gone to Glasgow Warriors. Ben Allen back to New Zealand. Richie Higgins has retired. At long last, Nicky Little is out. Brodie Runciman, Hayden Mitchell back to New Zealand for him, and Gavin Robertson, they're all out. In comes Dallas Pawley, Peter Eccles, Alan Walker from Curry, William Massey, Chris Keane, Andrew Skeen, Bruce Dick is back from Gala, and Thomas Wilson. So that's how Melrose line up at the moment as far as the ins and outs. There there could well be changes, of course, even at this late stage. For Gala, out goes Bruce Dick, as we mentioned, Gino Horua, Mitch Walton, Alan Johnson has retired, Mike Christie, Greg Marks, Mark Kibble, they're all out. In comes Craig Robertson via Hoyk, Craig Borthwick via Peebles, Gregor Hunter is back, Gary Lowry, Russell Anderson, Chris Auld and Bryce Turner. For Hoyk, out Craig Robertson, Gary Lowry, David Lowry and Alistair Marsh. In comes Lee Armstrong from Hoyk YM, who did so well last year, Nicky Little, Ross Gibson, Sean Muir and Stephen Bouglas. So that's the ins and outs for our Premier 1 side. Just a brief word, if you can, Stuart, on Gala and Hoyk's chances.
I think Gala, we talked there about momentum and the mindset of the players. I think they will want to tackle Premier 1 and treat each game as, you know, a huge occasion for the club, being back in the top flight after a few years out of the top flight rugby. It means so much to everybody involved that they're there, and I think you've obviously mentioned some of the players they brought in. There's some experience there from players that have had long spells at other clubs in the surrounding area, but they will know what it means to wear the maroon, or be it the white of Gala if they're in their change strip, of course. And I think that there's some good strong characters that certainly will enhance the dressing room at Gala there. It might be a long, difficult season for them, but I think they'll certainly give 100%, no question about that. And I think they'll perhaps cause a few upsets both at home and on the road during the course of the season. For Hoyk, of course, they've, again, like all the clubs, they've had a bit of an unsettled summer with some players leaving, some players progressing from Hoyk YM. A lot of people will say, you know, do you leave a successful formula? And that's very much what Hoyk YM is. But I think Armstrong felt that he wanted, you know, to play Premier 1 rugby, and this is a great opportunity for him at this stage in his career to show what he can do. And similarly, Hoyk have tried to freshen up the pack a little bit, because, you know, they finished in that top 8 in Premier 8 last season, albeit they were in that 8th place, but that was, you know, the real achievement for them after a season in the lower flight in Premier 2. So they'll be hoping that they can at least achieve that success this coming season, albeit I would imagine it'll be as hard, if not harder, this time round, because competition in that division is going to be so fierce.
Well, just finally, Kelso, Selkirk, Jed Forrest and Peebles battling out in Premier 2. Now, Kelso, out goes Adnan Osman, Mikhail Hartley, of course, back to South Africa. Ian Moody's gone to Boroughmuir. Gareth Riddle, Chris Keane, Na Ione and Frank Young have all departed Kelso. In comes Richard Minto to captain the side from Watsonians. Donald Seed is in. David Lowry in from Hoyk. Alistair Marsh from Hoyk. Lewis Mallon from Hoyk. Ryan Selkirk from Duns. Now, Selkirk, out goes Simon Willett and Matt Weller. In comes their two French guys. There's a prop, Clement Lecour, and a centre, Yannick Amil. For Jed Forrest, the only incoming is Johnny Cunningham, who's back in again. That's Darren Cunningham, the coach's nephew. Kevin Aitchison, I think, from Duns, and Andrew Irons. For Peebles, out goes Craig Borthwick, Willie Aitken, Dave McLean and Shannon Demita. In come Rory Milne, Josh Forrester, Jake Serex, Clemens Kindle, Nathan Mackay, Tawiri Walsh and David Kilgour. So lots and lots of changes there, particularly in Peebles. But Jed Forrest, for instance, out of all of them, I think probably the team with the least changes.
They have, and they made some interesting approaches and obviously had some success. You mentioned there Kevin Aitchison from Duns, and you think back about a decade or so to Scott Lindsay's time at Jed Forrest, and while he himself, I think, would admit he didn't quite settle in as well as he would have liked, I think Kevin Aitchison will step up from Duns and will make a real positive impression. He's quite a versatile back player. He's a big, physical, fast player, and I think he can offer them something that they perhaps need in reserve, or certainly I'm sure he'll be capable during the course of the season to hold down a starting position, because he, as I say, he's had the success. He's at a good age now to make that progression up to play at this level of rugby. But it's interesting that they are a side that remain fairly consistent in terms of their team selection. It's down to not wrapping up any of the players in cotton wool by any stretch of the imagination, but Jed Forrest, all the clubs you could argue have had some difficulties over the last few years with injuries, but Jed seemed to have been particularly affected by some serious long-term injuries to crucial players. If they can keep their players fit this season, and it's a conversation that many people have had associated with the clubs over the last few years, but I think if Jed in particular can keep that squad of players fit, they've bolstered it ever so slightly. I think they'll be in a very good position to just do what they haven't been able to do in the last couple of years, is just push on that little bit.
Well, it's obviously going to be very, very exciting. We'll be following the progress of our teams in Premier 1 and Premier 2. That's it for today's Little Natter. We're going to have a look at the RBS Cup and the Border League next time out.